There are moments when the meaning of justice feels distant, when the world seems to forget what fairness looks like, when power outweighs principle and people stop believing that one decision can make a difference. But sometimes, in the quiet corners of a courtroom, a single choice reminds us that true justice doesn't need to shout. It simply needs someone brave enough to stand up. This is the story of a man long overlooked, a retired Marine, a judge most had dismissed as too old, too tired, too far removed from the world's challenges. A man whose final ruling didn't just resolve a case, but echoed far beyond the walls of his courtroom. He didn't seek attention. He didn't care for praise. His life had been about service, not recognition. But on one morning, in a small Texas courthouse, he made a choice that reminded a nation what it means to do the right thing when no one else will. Few noticed when he entered that morning. Just another day, just another judge, at least that's what they thought. But those who were there would soon witness something rare, a moment where duty overcame doubt, and courage spoke not with loud words, but through quiet action. Before we share this remarkable story, we invite you to tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what justice means to you. If these stories move you, please like this video and subscribe to Everyday Quiet Heroes. The day began like any other. The Texas sun rose slowly, casting warm light across the stone steps of the Collin County Courthouse. Inside, the air held that familiar mix of old wood, paper, and quiet tension. The creak of worn benches, the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of attorneys preparing their cases, it all felt like background noise. Yet beneath that ordinary hum, something was building, a decision that would ripple far beyond these walls. Lawyers prepared their files. Observers settled into their seats, expecting another ordinary case, another routine hearing. No one knew that what was about to unfold would become a story retold in classrooms, community halls, and homes across the country. Judge Richard Kane entered the courtroom, his steps measured, his face lined with the years of service both on the battlefield and behind the bench. His white hair and quiet presence drew little notice from those who thought they knew what today's case would be. To most, he was just another aging judge, soon to retire, perhaps too old to see the sharp edges of modern disputes. But beneath the robe, beneath the years, was a man who had stood for fairness in places where fairness was often forgotten. He had worn the Marine uniform with pride, served in lands where decisions had consequences far beyond the page. And though his body showed the passage of time, his sense of duty remained sharp. The case before him seemed small, a boundary dispute. A corporation claimed a sliver of land that had belonged to Carl Benson, a disabled veteran who had lived quietly at the edge of town for decades. For the company, it was nothing more than a technicality, a line on a map to be redrawn with the right argument. For Carl, it was the last piece of his home that remained untouched. Carl sat in the courtroom, hands resting on a thin file, his shoulders slightly stooped, his eyes focused, his presence unremarkable to most in the room. But to Judge Kane, Carl represented every man who had ever given more than he received. The judge noted the way the corporation's lawyers avoided Carl's gaze, the way they spoke as if he weren't there at all. Arguments filled the air, polished and confident. Maps were unfolded, documents cited, cases referenced. The company's lawyers spoke smoothly, their words chosen to confuse, to bury the truth under layers of technical detail. But Kane listened not for the words themselves, but for what lay beneath. He watched faces, noted silences, felt the weight of intention. Outside, life in the city carried on. Cars passed, people hurried to work, unaware that inside this quiet chamber, a test of principle was unfolding. A test that would decide not just a plot of land, but whether honor still had a place in the law. As the arguments continued, the room grew still. Even the casual observers began to sense that something more was at stake. The usual rhythm of legal debate gave way to something heavier. The silence between the words spoke louder than the words themselves. Judge Kane took notes slowly, thoughtfully. His pen moved across the page with care, not out of habit, but out of the weight of responsibility he felt in every decision. He thought of the men he had served with, of promises made on fields far from home. He thought of what it meant to protect not just people, but ideals. Carl remained silent, respectful, waiting. His dignity in the face of the challenge did not go unnoticed. He could have spoken. He could have pleaded his case. But instead, he chose stillness, a quiet faith that truth would find its way through. And in that silence, the judge saw a strength that many miss, the power of quiet resilience. He recognized the courage it took to fight without anger, to hope without expectation. And as the final arguments closed, as the lawyers packed their papers and prepared to leave, Judge Kane knew that the decision he would write was more than a judgment on land. It would be a statement on what kind of justice he would leave behind. The courthouse grew quiet as Judge Kane began writing. His decision wasn't crafted for applause. It wasn't made for headlines. It was shaped by the same values that had guided him on distant battlefields and in quiet courtrooms alike. The ink flowed slowly, deliberately, as if each word carried the weight of the justice he had sworn to uphold. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting shadows across the courthouse steps. People passed by, unaware that inside, a man was finishing what would be his final act from the bench. His ruling would not only protect a small plot of land, it would remind everyone watching that fairness is not a relic of the past, but a living promise to those who still believe in it. When he finally set his pen down, the decision was clear. The corporation's claims were rejected. The land would remain with Carl Benson. But beyond the legal victory, the ruling delivered a message that the law exists not to serve the powerful, but to protect those who stand quietly, trusting that truth will prevail. The words were read aloud in the still courtroom. The corporate lawyers, who had entered with confidence, now packed their files in silence. Their arguments had been strong, but they had faced something stronger, a man's unshakable sense of duty. Carl remained seated, processing the moment. He hadn't asked for pity. He hadn't wanted attention. All he had hoped for was fairness. And now he had it, not as a gift, but as the result of a decision made with integrity. News of the ruling spread quickly. A bystander's short clip captured the stillness of the room as the decision was announced. What struck viewers most wasn't just the ruling, it was the atmosphere in that room. The pause that followed, the collective breath held by those present, the realization that they had just witnessed a rare kind of justice. A justice born not of spectacle, but of substance. That clip traveled far beyond the courthouse walls. It found its way onto screens across the nation. Headlines soon followed. The judge no one believed and just reminded America what justice means. Old Marine turned judge delivers a verdict that stunned a nation. But Judge Kane wanted no part of the spotlight. He turned down interviews. He declined speaking invitations. When local leaders tried to honor him, he redirected the attention to veterans like Carl, those whose quiet sacrifices too often went unnoticed. In the months that followed, Kane stepped down from the bench. His decision had been his last, and fittingly so. His name faded from the headlines, but the story remained. Teachers shared it in classrooms as an example of integrity. Veterans spoke of it in halls where honor was a word they lived by. In community centers and veterans gatherings, the story was retold, not for praise, but as a reminder. A reminder that the fight for what's right doesn't end on the battlefield. Sometimes, it continues in the quietest of rooms, at the stroke of a pen. And in homes across the country, people remembered that fairness isn't just a word written in law books. It's a choice made by those who have the courage to do what's right, even when no one expects them to. The courthouse eventually returned to its daily routine. New cases came and went, but those who were there would never see that room the same way again. The bench where Kane had sat, the chair where Carl had waited, these became symbols. Symbols of what it looks like when one person chooses principle over convenience, honor over ease. And now we ask you, what would justice look like in your eyes? What would you have done if you had been there that day? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your voice matters. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to Everyday Quiet Heroes for more stories of courage, honor, and silent strength.